You know, I live in the People's Republic of Ann Arbor, and our next guest actually lives in the People's Republic of Massachusetts. And we have more than that in common because whenever we speak about globalists or the globalist syndicate or the New World Order or their fascination, the globalists, with Satan, I can tell you that I appear to the people in Ann Arbor as having a third eye. And they immediately become defensive. Oh, Dave, there you go again on your conspiracy theory issues that really don't have any backbone. They don't have any evidence behind them. It's just pure conjecture. Well, our next guest, James Perloff, is going to give you facts, information, and he has dissected the globalists and their false flag playbook to really a huge degree. I think he's better at it than anyone I'm aware of. Let me give you a little background on James Perloff. Mr. Perloff is author of Shadows of Power, an expose of the Council on Foreign Relations that has sold over 100,000 copies, and 2 books about the evidence against Darwin's theory of evolution, including Tornado in a Junkyard. He wrote the New American Magazine for them for nearly 3 decades, and his newest book, Truth is a Lonely Warrior, is a comprehensive look at the satanic drive for world government. He also wrote the script for Free Minds Films documentary Shadow Ring, and his website, I encourage you to go there, James Perloff, P-E-R-L-O-F-F, 2 F's, jamesperloff.com. James, welcome to Caravan to Midnight.
Well, Dave, it's a pleasure to be back on the show and to meet you for the first time.
Well, James, so let's get the folks in the People's Republic of Ann Arbor and the People's Republic of Massachusetts up to date. Let's really try to educate those folks as far as, well, that the globalists, 1, do exist, and 2, that they are in search of a world government, and that there is a significant basis as it relates to satanic issues or foundations. And I think it's well developed in your recent book, Truth is a Lonely Warrior. Educate our listeners on the book and the relationships that you've dissected in that book.
Well, it's really a primer on the New World Order, and I know you wanted to get into false flags today. That's actually how I start out, as I talk about flags from the sinking of the Maine, and ultimately the book goes up to 9/11, because everybody can see that we've been involved in a lot of wars. Nobody can deny that. And when you take apart the events, the public pretext for the wars, you inevitably find that there was deception involved. So I think it's a good place to begin. So the second chapter is about the powers that be. And, my earlier book, The Shadows of Power, the bestseller you mentioned, is specifically about the Council on Foreign Relations, which is the main bridge between the oligarchy that runs America and the government, because they have to have a way to provide officers for the cabinet, even if the president himself isn't necessarily. The president is often, out there just for public show, but behind the scenes, the cabinet. This is as of the Obama administration, we've had 19 secretaries of state, 21 Treasury secretaries, 23 defense secretaries, and 16 CIA directors that have come out of the Council on Foreign Relations, a small, private organization that discusses foreign affairs in New York City. But since its very inception, has been dedicated to founding a world government. In fact, the whole reason the council was formed in 1921 was because the U.S. had rejected joining the League of Nations, which had been formed after World War I, and that was the first formal organized attempt at a world government. When we didn't come in, the bankers always learn their lessons. They say, okay, we didn't have enough public support for this, didn't have enough congressional support. They changed that when they got us to the UN at the end of World War II. There's a lot of continuity to all of this. And they tried to empower the UN through the Korean War, thinking they could make it the international peacekeeper. That was rejected, so they've resorted to regional stepping stones towards world government. The best example is the EU, but they formed NAFTA, which they hope would become an North American Union, just as the trade agreements in Europe had been used as the foundation of the European Union. There, coming out of the common market is what they called it. So there's a definite drive for world government, and well, I mean, you can just see it in their quotations. I mean, you go back to the very first issue of Foreign Affairs, which is their journal. The very first article was called "The Next American Contribution to Civilization," which was what? Join the League of Nations. And then the next issue in 1922 said there'll be no peace or prosperity for mankind so long as it remains divided into independent states. The real problem today is that of world government. And I can walk you through that magazine right up to current times, where they're calling for globalization or elements of globalization for this ultimate goal of world government, which is we know that you don't want to ever put all power in one place. The founding fathers understood that. That's why they divided power, and instead of having just an executive branch, they gave us the legislative branch, which was balanced within itself between the House and the Senate, plus a judiciary to keep an eye on the other branches of government, plus the states were supposed to check the power of the federal government through the state power. And, of course, that was pretty much nullified by the war between the states, and this whole system has been gradually eroded. But their ultimate goal is a world government, which would be a world tyranny. We know that just because of the Luciferian character. All you have to do is look at what these people have done, and you know that they don't have our best interest at heart.
So one of the ways in which that they gain more power, the globalists, the world government folks, more power, more control, which they're control freaks, and actually more money, which kind of drives the whole process, is through the utilization of false flags. And it's kind of part of their playbook. And you do a brilliant dissection of false flag events that have occurred and the ramifications of them. Why don't you kind of go through a bit of a list of them before we get to kind of what I call the big kahuna false flag?
Yeah, we know what the big kahuna was. Well, I actually was speaking at the Liberty Fest in New York City in 2015, and we each had 15 minutes. So I said, I'm going to try and condense the false flags into 15 minutes. We'll do less than 15 here, that's for sure. But we could start with this, thinking of the Maine, and people had been led up to the Spanish-American War. You know, Spain was controlling Cuba, which not coincidentally was the world's wealthiest colony and largest sugar producer by the 19th century. And there were people here in America, specifically National City Bank, which is the Rockefeller's bank, still exists today as a Citigroup. They wanted control of the sugar industry, which is, they called it white gold, just like the Rockefellers called oil black gold. So the Sinking of the Maine was the event that did that, but they also did the standard propagandizing, claiming that the Spaniards were throwing Cubans to sharks and roasting priests and all the phony atrocity propaganda that continues to this day. They always know that touches the heartstrings, and we're told we got to go down there and fight for freedom and democracy.
Kind of like the predecessor to the Iraqi-Kuwaiti deal that they were pulling babies out of incubators.
Yeah, that's another perfect example of fake atrocity. There are real atrocities. We know that. They commit them. But to get us into wars, they will fake the stories. And, of course, you can bring it up to the Lusitania, where a British ship with American passengers on board was sunk by a German U-boat. And the American public was told, well, the Germans sunk the ship just because they wanted to kill women and children. Right. And ultimately that led to our declaration of war 100 years ago. But what the public wasn't told was that Lusitania had 173 tons of rifle cartridges, 50 tons of shrapnel shells, 46 tons of aluminum powder, which is an explosive the British military used, mercury fulminate, another explosive, unnumbered tons of gun cotton, another explosive. And that's why the Lusitania went down after a single torpedo hit. In 18 minutes, it had struck the cargo hold and blew up the munitions, no matter what some of the establishment books say. But we were told it was just because of the they wanted to kill women and children standard. Okay, you bring it up to Pearl Harbor, and that's what I've written 2 cover stories on Pearl Harbor for the New American Magazine going back to 1986. Now, we really were attacked at Pearl Harbor by the Japanese. What people don't know is, number one, we provoked the Japanese by an embargo that we refused to lift. It was strangling them. Number 2, Roosevelt put the fleet in Pearl Harbor against all military advice. Never should have been there, boxed in like sardines, ideal targets for bombers. Totally contradicted naval advice, never held accountable by the mainstream media. Number 3, we knew about the attack in advance through decoded intercepts, both naval intercepts and diplomatic intercepts, plus personal warnings that Franklin D. Roosevelt received, as well as members of his cabinet. But we didn't share that with the military. We set them up there, and then there's a major cover-up afterwards to suppress that information. You can bring up the Korean War. not really a false flag there, but artificially contrived by us giving North Korea to Stalin. Stalin was made the trustee of North Korea as a reward for Russia participated in the Pacific War for how many days? 5 days.
Right.
After we dropped the atomic.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Dave.
No, absolutely. I mean, it was ridiculous.
We dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. After that, Stalin brought his troops into China to quote unquote fight the Japanese as a reward. We gave him North Korea. Mm-hmm. And of course, he armed the North Koreans to the teeth, and that led to the invasion, which was really, as I was mentioning, a trial run for the UN to become the world's peacekeeper. It didn't work out. But then you go up to, of course, everybody knows about Tonkin Gulf in Vietnam. Mm-hmm. President Johnson knew full well that what happened in Tonkin Gulf did not justify a war that led to 58,000 American deaths. And then you've mentioned baby incubators. We could mention the Mossad deception that led Reagan to bomb Libya in 1986. That's described in Victor Ostrovsky's book, The Other Side of Deception. You bring it up to, before we talk about the Big Kahuna, after the Big Kahuna of 9/11, we had a number of false pretexts to get into war, such as weapons of mass destruction that didn't exist. And then we go back to the old, it's for freedom and democracy or mantra. And of course, just most recently, you had President Trump launch 59 cruise missiles on Syria over a non-existent sarin gas attack.
Right.
Yeah. So that's kind of the big picture, some context.
And out of these false flag events, we get the globalists gain more power, more control, and more finances, don't they?
Well, they certainly get they financed the sides of both wars going back for years. We're talking about the Rothschilds and the other major banks, are basically satellites of the Rothschild banking monopoly. But they're also generating this new world order, doing nation building, taking out established governments and replacing them with their puppet governments. Even though they have democracy, they know that in a democracy you can always get your leader in because you control the press, and the people will vote for the candidate your press favors if you haven't already rigged the voting machines.
So that was actually an outstanding review, historical review of past false flags. So the Big Kahuna is September 11, 2001. And James, we all know that there were 19 hijackers that flew 3 planes or 4 planes, I guess, 2 into the World Trade Center, 1 into the Pentagon, 1 that left a really nice hole in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, and thousands of Americans died. And we ended up invading Afghanistan, followed by Iraq. And, well, I guess that's all we really know to know about that, isn't it? And that's actually 100% accurate.
I
know.
There might be one or two parts in there that are kind of accurate, but the whole 9/11 truth movement knows that that's a lie. The government official 9/11 Commission's conclusions are lies.
You have a great blog post on this. I mean, I'm an orthopedic surgeon by trade. It is a surgical dissection based on fact of what happened. So what you do in your surgical dissection, you say first, you go, who? All right? So one of the misnomers that you pointed out was there are some folks in the truth movement that say, well, this is a complete inside job. Well, in fact, what you say is, wait a minute, it's really more of an outside job.
Right, and I think that's led to the idea that 9/11 was a complete inside job has led to some misunderstandings, and we've all heard of the dancing Israelis. I think it is more accurate to say that 9/11 was an outside job by Israeli operatives. I'm talking about the operational level, but done with the consent and cooperation of people like Dick Cheney and other people high-ranking in our government.
So the first thing that comes up, James, when I talk about this is people look at me and they go, Dave, now why would the Israelis want to blow up the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and this plane that might have been flying into the White House? And why, of all people, would Dick Cheney and members of our own government want to be involved? Why would they be involved in this?
Well, from the Israeli perspective, first of all, at the beginning of the article, it's called 9/11 Simplified. It's my newest blog post at jamesperloff.com. And I do state at the outset that these are just suggestions, and I'm not insisting that my views on this are correct. This is just how I've broken it down. But as far as Israeli involvement goes, there's a wonderful blog post on the internet called, just from the Wikispook site, 9/11 Israel Did It, and they really summarize in a very comprehensive manner Israel's involvement. But to give you some examples, we have the dancing Israelis. It wasn't dancing FBI agents. It was dancing Israelis who, of course, were caught because a neighbor saw them celebrating. They were high-fiving each other when the World Trade Center collapsed. They were license number was written down. They were caught, and then the media said nothing more about it. And it turns out that they were released and sent back to Israel. And the man put in charge of the investigation of 9/11 in the Justice Department was Michael Chertoff, whose mother was a Mossad agent. And so does it surprise you that he released all the Israelis back to Israel? Then you look around, you see that the owner of the World Trade Center was Larry Silverstein. Mm-hmm. Now, he'd only owned it for less than 2 months. He invested $124 million, got almost $5 billion back in insurance payouts. And of course, he managed to avoid being at the World Trade Center the morning of the attack due to a fortuitous doctor's appointment. Mm-hmm. But what a lot of people don't know is that he was such good friends with Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, that Netanyahu was calling him every week. Netanyahu called Silverstein, not the other way around. And that's according to the Israeli newspaper Haaretz. You'll find all these references in my article. Mm-hmm. And, of course, you've got the Israeli company Odigo, which their employees received a warning not to be in the World Trade Center before the attack. You've got P-Tech, an Israeli intelligence-linked firm, providing software for the FAA and the Air Force that day. You have the head of the 9/11 Commission, Philip Zelikow, as a dual Israeli citizen. Now, why would you want an Israeli citizen with sworn loyalty to a foreign nation heading up your 9/11 investigation? There's so many, and I can't go through them all. Sure. So I'll refer people to the article, and especially the Wikispook article. But there's one I want to mention before we move on because it's relevant to today's discussion, and that is somebody who was on Flight 11, and that's Danny Lewin. Now, Danny Lewin was a former officer in the IDF, Israeli Defense Force, and was a member of Sayeret Matkal. That's their military special operatives. Mm-hmm. And Danny Lewin had an official portrait taken prior to 9/11 before two panels that looked like the Twin Towers, and he's wearing a watch, a Swatch watch, the hijacker model. And the watch, the second hand, the minute hand, the hour hand are all on the 11th, and the date was set to the 11th, even though the picture wasn't taken on the 11th. Now, he had to stop at the watch at that moment. Now, the odds against that having by chance are over 20,000 to 1. And on 9/11, he was on Flight 11 in row 9. Row 9 of Flight 11 on 9/11. He's got a big smile on his face in this picture. He knows what's going down on 9/11. And I believe he had a big part in what happened that day. But the other thing I would just say about Israel is when you look at crime, one of the things a police detective asks is who benefited. Obviously, America didn't benefit. We spent trillions of dollars on these wars. We've had developed into a police state. The Middle East Muslims, who we blame, they didn't benefit. The Middle East has turned into chaos. Mm-hmm. Hundreds of thousands of deaths, depleted uranium bombs, millions of people driven from their homes. The only beneficiary is Israel. They've sat back and watched as America takes out their enemies one by one in fulfillment of what they call Theodore Herzl's Greater Israel Plan, or the Yinon Plan developed in the 1980s, where all of Israel's surrounding enemies would be broken up. That's what we're seeing fulfilled, I believe. And again, people, if they want to read about the Yinon Plan and the Greater Israel Plan, I would suggest going to Global Research, the article called Greater Israel. So, I'll leave Israel there, but back to you.
So, James, when you speak about this, and you mention this in your blog, the first thing that comes out of people's mouths is the fact that you're even considering Israel as a player in this means you're anti-Semitic.
Yeah, I'm half Jewish. The name Perloff is actually a variation of the Jewish name Perlovsky. So I always say, look, you can ditch that right away, okay? I'm half Jewish. My mother was not Jewish. My father was. This is based on fact. It has nothing to do with anti-Semitic. The accusation of anti-Semitism has been used far too often as a knee-jerk reaction to discredit people and to stifle them when they criticize Israel's actions, such as the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians.
And I must say, your blog post is probably the most well-referenced blog post I've come across on the issue or on any issue. I mean, it is thoroughly documented and researched with a factual background. So your contention is, after your research on this, that this was a outside job with inside support within the government.
Correct. And then I break it down into three things, which is how did the towers come down, what hit the towers, and what actually happened to the planes and passengers.
And the reason why these entities were involved, your contention, is because they were interested in a larger theater for our involvement in the Middle East, such as not only land domination but resource domination, and part of this globalist agenda of a world under one power.
Right. I should mention that every government has a capital, and we were talking about world government. The intended capital of this world government is Jerusalem. Ben Gurion declared that in Look magazine, 1962, that the world would one day have its capital in Jerusalem, and a number of rabbis have said that. And even the Bible talks about that in 2 Thessalonians, that the man of lawlessness will reign over, whatever the Antichrist, the one who rules over every tribe and nation, and no one can buy or sell without his mark. It says in the book of 2 Thessalonians that he will rule from a temple in Jerusalem, pretending to be God. And so we know that this is what their aim ultimately is, to, in a Luciferian fashion, take over Jerusalem, which was long considered God's city. It's revered by Muslims, Christians, and Jews alike. And for Satan to set up his puppet there, thumbing his nose at God and ruling the world. So this very much does tie into the world government scheme.
Let's move on to the how, which you do in your blog post. How were the towers destroyed? For example, we have video evidence on that day, to play devil's advocate here. We have video evidence of one plane striking each of the towers.
Right. I'm going to move backwards on this and do it in the same order as my post. I think it may help us to move through this. And by the way, I just got to mention, Dave, that normally to do this takes about a 90-minute show. We have about 20 minutes left. I'm going to kind of condense it, but there are three camps on how the towers came down, with the ultimate quote-unquote collapse, right? And those three camps are directed energy weapons, nanothermite, and nuclear. I believe in nuclear. I believe we're talking about 2 Israeli suitcase nukes in the bottom of elevator 50. That was the elevator that ran the full length of either twin tower. I believe they were exploded down there. But I'm going to be, in my article, I can condense this down to 10 reasons why I believe it's a nuclear event. I respect people in the other camp, by the way. Other camps are very intelligent, and I have friends in both of the other camps. But I have an extended post on this. It's called To 9/11 and Beyond, Why It Was a Nuclear Event. But for the sake of this post, I did 10 reasons, and let's go through those 10 reasons. Number one, the first responders are getting cancer at a high rate. And what cancer did they get more than any other in comparison to its expected rate? It's thyroid cancer. It was only known environmental cause is an atomic bomb, environmental cause. Nuclear bomb gives off iodine-131, which embeds in the thyroid. And this is why people keep potassium iodide tablets on hand. That's reason number one. You'll find the citations in my posts. Number two, U.S. Geological Survey examined the dust samples from the World Trade Center and found high quantities of the elements of nuclear fission. We're talking about uranium, thorium, cadmium, strontium, barium, beryllium, and in correlations that could only come from a nuclear explosion. That's number two. Number three is the fires that lasted for over 3 months after molten steel. A nuclear event is an extremely hot event. It's extremely hot, and it's a signature. Heat isn't a signature of an atomic bomb. Number four is the force that threw multi-ton parts of the World Trade Center hundreds of feet and embedded them or knocked over parts of buildings across the street. A nuclear explosion is the most powerful known to man. It has sufficient force to do that. Reason number 5, and I probably need to start getting to my notes here so I don't forget something. Reason number 5. The total vaporization of the inner contents of the Twin Towers, all the people, all the furniture, all the computers, completely vaporized, nothing left except one filing cabinet out of 10,000. Nuclear bomb would do that. It's the explosion that keeps on exploding. It's not like a stick of dynamite. It goes boom and it's done. It keeps on exploding. It will account for that vaporization. Number 6 is the seismographic readings at Palisades, New York, which when the towers quote unquote collapsed, showed a gigantic off-the-chart spike, which is best accounted for by a giant explosion. Number 7, and this is where I go a little bit unique, and this is with the help of people who are expert on nuclear weapons. We're talking about 2 suitcase nukes, which are small enough, by the way, to carry in a backpack in the bottom of the World Trade Center. And I believe this explains the rest of the damage to the World Trade Center. Buildings 5 and 7 caught on fire when, obviously not before, the World Trade Centers collapsed. The Twin Towers collapsed. Otherwise, you'd see smoke plumes coming from those other buildings. It is my belief that the reason the other buildings collapsed and had fires in them, and Building 6 was cratered out. All of the other buildings were cratered out and caught on fire, right? Building 7 obviously came down later that afternoon with a controlled demolition. There's no doubt about that. But the reason for these fires and other damage was that underneath the World Trade Center, most people don't know this, they were all interconnected by a tunnel, an underground water drainage system, which connected to the bottom of elevator 50 where these nukes would have been. So the blast in the basement of the World Trade Center, it was down in the elevator pits, carved in the bedrock, would have followed the path of least resistance up to the elevator shaft, but also the path of least resistance through the underground drainage system, sending its secondary force into all these other buildings. That's why Barry Jennings in Building 7, he was the emergency coordinator for the New York Housing Authority, said that he was in the building and it was an explosion from the bottom up. It was incredibly hot, and it blew out the stairwell beneath him and a colleague, and they had to be rescued by the fire department. It's a secondary effect of the nukes, and there's more on it in my article. But number 8 is that big cloud that everybody's running from.
Right.
A nuclear explosion will give out a cloud of that caliber. Number 9 is Susan Lindauer, CIA asset, said that the CIA prior to 9/11 had advance warning of these attacks, and that according to those advance warnings, the Twin Towers would be destroyed by a mini nuke. So that was the evidence the CIA already had in advance. But number 10 is Benjamin Netanyahu wrote a book in 1995 called Fighting Terrorism. I'll quote it, page 125. Quote, such groups nullified the need to have air power or intercontinental missiles as delivery systems for an Islamic nuclear payload. They will be the delivery system. In the worst of such scenarios, the consequences would not be a car bomb, but a nuclear bomb in the basement of the World Trade Center, unquote, Benjamin Netanyahu. And let me just play a clip of him 2 days after 9/11 talking to Tom Brokaw. This will just take...
We have here is something far worse. In 1995, I wrote a book called Fighting Terrorism, and I said that if we don't arrest the tide of Islamic militant Islamic terrorism, then the next thing that will be is not a car bomb in the World Trade Center, but a nuclear bomb. Now, it wasn't a nuclear bomb. It was a 350-ton conventional bomb. But
okay, so here you have Tom Brokaw being talked to by Benjamin Netanyahu. Netanyahu is not saying the World Trade Center came down from a plane. He's telling him right there it came down from a bomb. He first says nuclear, and then he realizes he's giving away too much, so he says conventional. Right. They even knew the precise tonnage of the bomb, which is quite impressive. And as to why we don't have high Geiger counter readings, I see we have about 12 minutes left here. Is that correct?
No, we can go longer. That's no problem.
Really?
Yeah.
How long can we go? How long can we go?
How long? Whatever it takes.
Really?
Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay. People will ask why there weren't these high Geiger counter readings. Actually, there is some evidence for Geiger counter readings, but there are several reasons. The fact is that not all bombs are like the Nagasaki, Hiroshima bombs and give off high amounts of radiation. During the Cold War, we developed what we call tactical or battlefield nukes, which would give off a low amount of radiation. A bomb which is high in fission, the breaking apart of nuclear particles, will give off a lot of radiation. But if it's high in fusion, which is the fusing together of nuclear particles, it will be low in radiation. Now, what kind of nukes do you think Israel stockpiles? We don't know. It's a state secret. But obviously, they would want low radiation nukes because if they get into a war with their neighbors, they don't want radiation going back to Tel Aviv.
That's right.
And that would be the kind of suitcase nukes they would have, low radiation bombs. But I also mentioned other reasons, such as the fact that if you explode a nuclear bomb in a shaft, it'll reduce radiation by 90%. Plus, even though 9/11 was a clear day, the next 4 days it rained, and of course Giuliani poured all that dirt over the World Trade Center. All these things would have reduced the amount of radiation that you would see in the atmosphere and reduce your ability to detect it by Geiger counter. So, but that kind of completes what I believe took down the Twin Towers.
So then you got into, in your blog post, your dissection of what, in addition to the explosive, what struck the towers. Right? We saw the video. We saw the video of one object hitting each of the towers. Or did we?
People certainly saw what looked like a plane hitting the towers. And, what I mentioned in the article, Dave, is when I first heard no planes on 9/11, I said, come on, you guys, that's cognitive dissonance. Yeah. It's being done to make us look ridiculous. But then I started thinking, Shanksville.
Yeah. The hole in the ground. The hole in the ground.
Nothing but a hole in the ground. Yeah. And to quote the coroner, Wallace Miller, said, "quote This crash was different. There was no wreckage, no bodies." I mean, how can you have no bodies, no wreckage, and nothing? They said bigger than a phone book, right? Then you look at the Pentagon, and to quote Karen Katowski, Lieutenant Colonel, retired U.S. Air Force PhD, she said, "quote There was a dearth of visible debris on the relatively unmarked Pentagon lawn where I stood only minutes after the impact. Beyond the strange absence of airliner debris, there was no sign of the kind of damage to the Pentagon structure one would expect for the impact of a large airliner. This visible evidence or lack thereof may also have been apparent to the Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, who in an unfortunate slip of the tongue referred to the aircraft that slammed into the Pentagon as a missile," unquote, Lieutenant Colonel Katowski. Add to this, I've got this clip embedded. April Gallup was in the Pentagon. She walked out with many other employees through that hole that allegedly a plane went through and penetrated through 3 concrete layers, aluminum plane, give me a break. She said they could not see any bodies, any signs of plane wreckage, seat cushions, luggage, anything that would have come from a plane. We've got no decent photos despite all the security cameras. We have this one photo from a parking lot that showed sort of a flash of something going by. We don't know what it is. And, of course, the impossibility of a commercial plane pulling out of that deep descent. It would have crashed. How did it go perfectly parallel to the Pentagon lawn without even scuffing it? So I looked at this and I said, well, without this evidence of planes at Shanksville and the Pentagon, is it possible no plane hit the Twin Towers? And I believe that is a correct assessment because we're looking at 2 impossibilities when we look at Flight 175. That's the one we've got most of the images of. Number one, Flight 175, which hit to the second tower, was going at 590 miles an hour. You cannot control a plane at that speed. And I've got an embedded clip there from Pilots for 9/11 Truth. It's a 6-minute clip. They show that experienced Boeing pilots tried to hit the Twin Towers at those speeds. They couldn't do it. And, everything had to be perfectly planned on 9/11. If the plane had just clipped it with a wing, there's no way they could have collapsed it later. They had to guarantee both those planes would make a bullseye. You can't do that at those speeds. There's no way they could guarantee it. The second thing, Dave, is, of course, you've seen this. When Flight 175 goes into the South Tower, it vanishes. The aluminum wings and tail don't break off. They go right through the 14-inch steel columns like it was melted butter. And that can't happen. It just can't happen. So in my article, I look at a couple of options, but the one I'll just mention here is the possibility of a cloaked missile. A missile resolves a lot of issues. A missile can be controlled for a precise hit, unlike it doesn't have those G-forces going against it like a plane does. Modern cruise missiles have onboard cameras. They can be slowed down, speeded up. They have GPS guidance systems, etc. And then their noses are hardened for penetration to enter a building, unlike airliner noses, which get bashed in by bird strikes. Just a bird can at speed has bashed them in. So a missile would make sense. Now, could the Israelis hit us with a missile? The answer is yes. This really shook me when I looked at it. In 1999, they commissioned their first Dolphin-class submarines, which are capable of launching cruise missiles. And in 2000, U.S. Navy observed them test firing these cruise missiles in the Indian Ocean the year before 9/11. Could they cloak them? Now, I've got the pictures there in the article, but in the 1990s, the U.S. Air Force was working on something called an airborne holographic projector, which was so good that it could project the image of an airplane in broad daylight and deceive enemy aircraft personnel. So, into aircraft personnel. So, if they can do that for a fighter plane, they could certainly do it for a jetliner. Could the Israelis do it? Well, I found this was emailed to me. But in 1987, there was a Defense Department paper called "Critical Technical Assessment in Israel," showed that back in 1987, there was an Israeli firm called Ep6 that was developing holographic technology for stealth applications. That's what they called it. So, could they have fired such a missile and cloaked it from a submarine? I don't know, but it raises the possibility. There's another option I looked in there in the article, which is drones, but that's kind of what I lean to for the reasons I gave, that this may have been a cloaked missile.
So then, if that's the case, James, what would have happened then, based on your attempt at reconstructing what happened on that day? What happened then to the original planes and passengers? Right,
and that's where I take a turn that is contrary to where the 9/11 movement and myself have gone in the past.
So maybe where has it gone in the past, and where are you now then?
Okay, well, here's the thing. We know that leading up to the hijackings, or alleged hijackings, there was a whole bunch of evidence being planted. You had Muhammad Atta, who in Germany was a shy guy who hated to fly, shy around girls. And then he comes to Florida. He's this party animal, loves to snort cocaine. And 3 days before 9/11, he and the two other alleged hijackers go to Shuckham's Oyster Bar. They're making all kinds of noise. They fight with the manager. He says, "I'm an airline pilot." He pays with a $100 bill. And then just to read...
kind of like the Oswald setup in New Orleans.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Oh, exactly. You have, let me quote from CBS News, September the 14th, 2001. This is more of the setup that's leading up to it. Okay, quote, 3 men spewed anti-American sentiments in a bar and talked of impending bloodshed the night before the terrorist attacks on New York and Washington, a Daytona Beach strip club manager interviewed by the FBI said Thursday. They were talking about what a bad place America is. They said, "Wait till tomorrow, America's going to see bloodshed," said John Capp, manager of the Pink Pony and Red Eye Jack sports bar. In Daytona Beach, Capp said he told FBI investigators the men in his bar spent $200 to $300 apiece on lap dances and drinks, paying with credit cards. Capp said he gave the FBI credit card receipts, photocopied driver's licenses, a business card left by one man, and a copy of the Koran, the sacred book of Islam, that was left at the bar. If you're on a secret mission...
Yeah.
Dave, you don't leave behind your ID. You don't say I'm an airline pilot. You don't brag about what you're going to do. You don't leave your Koran at a strip club. It doesn't happen. But the day of 9/11, they found a Koran and a flight training manual in a car at Logan Airport. And then how did the FBI identify the 19 hijackers? Well, on Muhammad Atta's luggage, which somehow didn't make it onto the plane,
Convenient.
They found the identity of all the hijackers.
Oh, perfect.
And that's how they knew.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? So here's what we do in the truth movement. And here's why I think we took, including myself, took the wrong turn. We say, okay, we know that half these hijackers turned out to be alive later. That became news overseas within days. They were complaining, saying, "Hey, look, that's my picture, that's my name, that's my ID, but that's not me. It's a stolen ID."
So has that ever been reported in the U.S. that you're aware of, James?
Well, even Robert Mueller, the director of the FBI, admitted shortly after 9/11 it appeared that they'd used some stolen IDs, but they never found out who the original hijackers were. And the 9/11 Commission showed no interest. But here's what we do in the truth movement, okay? We say, okay, they weren't competent to fly these planes. They couldn't even handle a twin-engine Cessna at 65 miles an hour.
Right.
They'd never been in a Boeing cockpit before.
Right.
And they turned up alive. So we say, okay, so there wasn't a hijacking that day unless maybe they were electronically hijacked. So now we turn our attention on the flight attendants and the passengers who made phone calls. And we turn them into the heavies, them into the bad guys. We say, you know what, those flight attendants and those passengers, they must have been working with the CIA, and they made up that whole story about the hijacking and what they saw that day. And so we say, well, what happened to them is, well, they were probably paid off by the CIA and they're living on their new identities, something like that, right? But would you really pay a guy $1 million to give him a new identity for a 30-second phone call?
Nope.
What about their families? They got to be in on it now,
it's
too.
Too many loose ends, James.
Too many loose ends. And then people say, well, they use voice morphine. But, to call somebody and say, this is your husband, John, using a voice print. What if they say, what do I tell Nikki? Your wife says, what do I tell Nikki? And you don't even know if Nikki's a family member or a friend. Just so many problems you could run into. Right. I started looking at this again from the Israeli viewpoint. I said, wait a minute. There was a hijacking. Here's a sentence that just jumped out at me. It's from September 21st, 2001, London Telegraph. Quote, accounts from the other doomed planes indicate the hijackers encouraged people to call their families and tell them what was happening.
Who in the world is going to do that?
Yeah, no hijacker cares that you call your family.
No.
But these guys were still establishing the narrative. Remember Charlie Hebdo? Charlie Hebdo, there were these two guys in black outfits. They got into a car. They started shouting, Allahu Akbar. And they drove off. They made sure they were photographed right.
Yeah, right.
I think that just like on Charlie Hebdo, there are real people on those planes. And I started looking at how this could have occurred. And I realized that this is Israeli special ops. This is Danny Lewin. Remember the Mr. 11-11-11-11 with his hijacker?
Right, that was sitting, you said was sitting in row 9 or something.
Yeah, it's on row 9 of Flight 11 on 9/11. And his group, I got to give you a quote on Danny Lewin from the mainstream media to make this understandable. Okay. He could bench press 315 pounds and was trained to kill terrorists with a pen or credit card or just his bare hands, unquote. Sarat Makal is their elite special ops. They would never have trusted the Mossad with this job. This is elite special ops. And think about it, Dave. Unlike the Muslims down at the flight training school, these guys would have plenty of experience on Boeings. Why? Because Israel has plenty of Boeing 757s and 767s in their El Al fleet. So they can sit as jump seaters in the cockpit on their flights. They'll become co-pilots, and the Al could give them a Boeing of their own. And they could have put that Boeing, not only could they fly it all over the Indian Ocean, but they could put it in a hangar and practice cockpit invasion dozens and dozens of times. Okay, boys, 9 seconds. Let's get it down to 8 seconds. And I found this out, too, Dave. In 2001, every plane was locked. The cockpit was locked upon takeoff. And this is because of the history of hijackings that had preceded 9/11. Mm-hmm. But guess what? It was a standard lock and key for every cockpit.
Really? The same key? The same master key?
Right, same master key, because they figured what terrorist is going to get hold of such a key, right?
Right.
So on 9/11, all they had to do was take one key from a El Al Boeing 757. How did they get into the cockpit so fast, not even giving the pilots time to type in the hijacking code like they were trained to do? Right. Well, they had seats in the first row of first class. They acted like they're going to the bathroom. They opened that door with a key. That ain't to kick it down.
No.
What if they don't? That would get the pilots, alarm the pilots. And they're not going to hold, what if they held a box cutter to a stewardess's throat, right? Say, let us in and we'll kill the broad, right? Yeah. Well, what if that doesn't work? Right. No, this thing had to be guaranteed. The way to guarantee it is you've got a key, you go in, you kill the pilots instantly, just like Dan Leo can do, and it's been suggested to me they might have used something like an EpiPen, which is, well, you're a doctor, you know. Sure. You just stick it on the person's skin, you push the button.
Paralyzing agent.
But in this case, it's injecting poison. Yeah. The pilots are dead within a couple of seconds. They've already practiced taking the pilots out of their seats. Now they close the door and lock it behind them. Now they're in control, and they know those Boeing controls perfectly. Mm-hmm. So that raises the next question, which, of course, if that's what happened, then how do they get rid of the planes and the passengers if the planes didn't hit those targets?
Right. Did they land them at another location and offload the passengers? Did they? What happened? What do you believe happened at this point?
What I believe now happened, and I realize this goes against the grain of 9/11. I'm just making this a suggestion. Is there's only one place they could have flown those planes. They couldn't fly them to an American military base because you still got to dispose of the passengers, still got to dispose of the planes, and you might risk witnesses. Right. The only place to take them is the direction they're already headed, which is straight out into the Atlantic for a rendezvous with the same Israeli sub that fired those cruise missiles. And wait a minute, if you don't mind, if we have time, I want to play a short clip. Mm-hmm. This is from the FAA control saying that Flight 11 did not hit the World Trade Center. This is in real time, but it's headed south. It did not. Whatever hit the Trade Center was not Flight 11. So let me just bring this clip up. It'll take about 1 minute. Here we go.
When an unidentified target was approaching Washington, D.C. from the west, a message was sent out in the system that American 11 was still airborne.
Scoggins Military, Boston Center, just had a report that American 11 is still in the air and it's on its way heading towards Washington.
Okay, American 11 is still in the air on its way towards Washington?
There was only another aircraft that hit the tower. That's the latest report we have.
Okay.
I'm going to try to confirm an ID weight, but I would assume he's somewhere over either New Jersey or somewhere further south.
Okay, so American 11 isn't the hijack at all then, right?
No, he is a hijack.
American 11 is a hijack?
Yes.
And he's going into Washington?
Could be a third aircraft.
It could be a third aircraft going on to Washington. Do you have a Mode 3 on him, sir?
With number 3, we're trying to get a radio to me if I can. This is a report I had from Washington Center. You might want to get someone on another phone talking to Washington Center to see if they have them tracked up.
Copy that.
And then get...
Okay.
So James, in putting this together, so did they bring up, for example, to take the signal, the aeronautic signal of the planes? Did they bring up this potential missile, cloak it, and then have it fly in conjunction with, for example, in this case, Flight 11, missile hits the World Trade Center? Is this what you believe? And then that just kept going on? They turned off the transponder afterwards? Or how did that happen?
They would have turned off the transponder very early. The cruise missile can fly low enough to avoid radar detection, and perhaps they let a radar signal come out as it lined up with the plane and then hit the tower while the plane keeps flying. If it was, some people think it was a drone, and I think that's a credible hypothesis too. But my belief is that they headed south and that for a rendezvous with the sub. Now, these pilots would have practiced landing Boeings many times in the ocean. It definitely is doable. And that raises the question of what happened to the passengers, because they're not making phone calls at this time. There's only one way to kill these passengers. Now, it can't be a bomb because you're going to blow yourself up. And they're not going to go around machine gunning everybody. The ideal way to kill those passengers and keep yourself alive is with a poison gas. Now, on Flight 93 and on Flight 11, there were phone calls reported that the hijackers had a bomb. You could see the bomb. And on Flight 175, they said there was not a definite report of seeing the bomb, but the hijackers said they had one. I believe that it was not a bomb, and I believe that it was not a prop. I think it was probably a gas canister. So all they have to do at this point, once the quote-unquote strikes on the World Trade Center and Pentagon have been made, they take that canister, they throw it into the cabin, and in a pressurized cabin, something like cyanide gas, I don't know what gas would be, but cyanide gas can render you unconscious in seconds and kill you in minutes. In the meantime, the hijackers go back to the cockpit. They got the door sealed. The gas is not affecting them. They've got their American Airlines or United Airlines oxygen masks on. They take these planes out to the Atlantic. They land. They set the coordinates for the sub. They land in the water. They're wearing their life jackets, which American Airlines and United have kindly provided them with. They pop a window in the cockpit. They're picked up by a small craft from the sub, and then the plane goes down to the bottom of the ocean. The ideal tomb for the passengers, the ideal way to get rid of the passengers in the planes is at the bottom of the ocean, just like with the Lusitania, the Maine, with the attendant of the USS Liberty in 1967. Mm-hmm. The people who do false flags know the best way to bury evidence is the bottom of the ocean. And let me just add one thing on this. There's an old Air Force pilot named Phil McConnell, and I don't know if he's ever been on John's show or not, but he's on a lot of truther shows, and he says that 11, 175, and 77 were all destroyed in what is called Whiskey 386, a military training exercise zone, restricted zone, which is 60 miles off the coast of Virginia. Ideal place to drop the planes. And actually, if you listen to more of the live conversation over the airwaves, there were pilots headed out to Area 386 but called back. I assume that Dick Cheney was making sure that no aircraft, he was in command that day. Of course, they wouldn't trust Bush with it, that no aircraft went out there to spot this rendezvous where the planes met up with the sub. But the one plane that didn't make it was 93.
Now, it's possible. So I've seen video evidence of planes trying to land on water, and they disintegrate. I mean, but you believe it's possible that you could land a Boeing on water and have survivors?
Definitely, it was done in the Hudson. There was a Chinese plane that landed in the ocean with 396 on board. Everybody survived. Maybe this is not the way it's done, but I have a close friend, the co-producer of our movie Shattering. Marilyn Moore was a career flight attendant, and she and I have talked over the situation many times. And said, yeah, they train for that all the time for potential. When you're going overseas, you train for potential ocean landing. The plane would have sunk quickly, but if these guys had practiced it enough, yeah, they could have definitely brought it down next to the sub.
Which leaves us one plane left, right? So
93.
You believe, were crash landed, if you will, in this area 386. But we still have flight, was it 93?
Mm-hmm.
Over Shanghai.
Yeah, no, what I believe happened with 93 is this. I think Phil McConnell's right. It was shot down, and I've got some footage in the blog post on my website, jamesperloff.com. The post, again, is called 9/11 Simplified. There's footage of was at the time live of news stations saying that we understand another plane's been intercepted by the F-16s. They didn't even know yet it was called Flight 93. And there's also a clip of Dick Cheney with a guilty expression saying, yes, I said that at this point we had to intercept any incoming planes. And I know that Chris Boleyn and others have talked about this scattering of wreckage over a large area of Pennsylvania, which would not be the same as the hole. I think that smoking hole is probably the cruise missile that they decided to discard. And I tell you the truth, I didn't believe the Let's Roll story like a lot of people for years, but I now believe Let's Roll happened, and I believe Let's Roll is the reason that Flight 93 was shot down, Dave. The plane left 40 minutes late. I believe the original plan was to take out the White House and the Pentagon, because nothing would have ramped up America like an attack on the White House and the Pentagon. It was supposed to happen at the same time, but the plane was 40 minutes late. The hijackers should have never tried it, but they did. And on this plane, as you know, I'm now accepting these phone calls at face value. And by the way, cell phones worked pretty damn good in 2001. My friend Marilyn Moore, the flight attendant, it was an analog system back then. The cell phones had strong transmitters, and few people tried it out because it was against the rules. Right. But she was once in a plane with a pilot friend as passengers. The pilot took out his AT&T flip phone. This is 1998. Called his wife, handed the phone to Marilyn. This is at altitude over Nebraska, until they were told to stop that by one of the flight attendants. Some of the cell phone calls, I'm sure, didn't connect that day, but along with the air phone calls, the hijackers had the narrative they wanted. But what happened on 93 was there really was, I believe, in Let's Roll. They overwhelmed the Israeli special op, that's what they call them, outside the door. And now the pilots have locked this cockpit door, but the thing is the flight attendants have their own key. They always did for emergencies. Now they're getting into the cockpit. Now there's a confrontation, and Cheney at this point realizes that if this plane lands and they overwhelm the hijackers, because one of the passengers, his name was Donald Green, was a licensed pilot. Mm-hmm. If with the help of air control and the flight attendants, they made a rough landing and the Israelis are still alive, Dave, the entire narrative of 9/11 would have fallen apart. They find Israel's behind this. Israel's special relationship with the United States goes down the drain. There's no Middle East wars. I think Cheney shot the plane down, not to save the White House. I think he shot it down to save 9/11. That's what I honestly believe now. I think he may have even, for all I know, he consulted with Netanyahu and Netanyahu said, go ahead and obliterate the plane. For special ops, it's worth it to sacrifice them to keep this whole scheme happening. So that's what I believe. So my take is a little bit different, but that kind of summarizes. I believe that 9/11 might have been as simple as this. 2 suitcase nukes in the shafts of Elevator 50 on 9/11. I do believe there were pre-planted explosives at the plane strike levels. There's evidence of thermite there. They needed to make up what they call a plane cutout. There's the Israeli art students, as I'm sure you heard of, were given free access. They even lived up there. I believe that a cloaked missile, or perhaps a drone, was what struck the towers. It was missiles launched from an Israeli sub. They had that capability, and they had cloaking ability. And I believe that the planes, except for 93, were taken out and sunk at sea. Best place to hide all the evidence, bottom of the ocean.
You know, interesting we're having this conversation today because a couple days ago, IntelliHub, the website, came out with a report by Shepard Ambellis, and it said, a headline, "A power down took place in the World Trade Center just days before 9/11 attacks." The World Trade Center South Tower in particular was powered down prior to attack, offering a window of opportunity for explosives to be planted in the building. It appears that a fellow has come forward now. A senior database administrator named Scott Forbes worked in the South Tower at the time and has confirmed on record that there was in fact a power down that occurred and was witnessed by many. Quote, there was a power down in the South Tower on the weekend of the 8th and 9th of September. I worked on it. I was in the tower at the time, and I know for a fact it occurred along with many colleagues, end quote.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I quote Scott Forbes in my book, Truth of the Lonely Warrior, in the chapter 9/11. And might have been planting explosives. It's also possible that they were planting the nukes. That I believe, and I know that there are many views on this, but this would also be it could be that Larry Silverstein gave the Israelis a free rein to go up to the plane strike levels the weekend before, and also to put these nukes in place. They wouldn't have wanted the nukes there for long, I don't think.
So this is something you don't know, James. On the day it occurred, I called my dad. My mom and he lived in Chicago and did their whole lives. And my dad was a civil engineer. And he built very large buildings in the city of Chicago. And I called him to make sure. I said, hey, are you watching this? Yeah. And here's what he said. Now, my dad served in the military honorably. He did a lot of things during World War II that utilized his engineering experience to help win the war, if you will, for the United States. And this is what he said to me. He said, Dave, I know what I just saw. But as a civil engineer that builds large buildings, I can't explain what I just saw. It makes no sense. He goes, I studied the World Trade Center before we built some large buildings in Chicago. I know that structure. And I know what I saw on TV. I saw a plane hit it. And what happened makes no sense to me. And I can't just figure this out. I need to call some people and other my buddies, the other engineers, because this is just not adding up. And as the days went on, and as the weeks went on, and as the months went on, James, he kept calling his friends, and they all kept talking. Mm-hmm. And until the day he died on January 28th, 2003, 2 days before he died, we actually talked about it again. And he said, you know, Dave, another year's gone by, and none of us can figure this out and make any sense out of what we saw and what happened.
Well, there you go. My son's a civil engineer, by the way. And by the way, I'm in the medical field as you are. I'm a registered nurse, so we share a number of personal things in common. Yeah, it's that kind of professional testimony. There's led many people to join architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth. The fact that it doesn't make sense at all, and it's quite often the people who are most expert in these fields who render opinions like your father had. And I'm so delighted that you were able to share with him about that during his lifetime.
You know, Jim, when you start talking about this, and you start saying, you know, things just, like when I talk about what my dad said, and people are saying, well, Dave, okay, we understand it doesn't make sense engineering-wise, but sometimes things happen that you just can't explain based on your training. But Dave, for this to have happened, other than what the government has told us, there would have to be thousands of people that were complicit in all this, and that, what people say, is impossible. That somebody would start spilling the beans. That this couldn't go, and it surely couldn't go on for now 16 years. What do you say to that, James? How do you handle that when people tell you that?
A couple things are that there are people who have spilled the beans, and we quoted people like eyewitnesses like Karen Katowski, and there are people certainly who have died under suspicious circumstances. But here's also where the Israeli did it hypothesis comes in, and I take as a comparison the attack on the USS Liberty in 1967. President Johnson and Defense Secretary McNamara cooperated with the attack by calling back the fighters that were trying to rescue the USS Liberty, and then they ordered a cover-up.
And that has been documented.
Yeah, but at an operational level, it was Israelis, not Americans, attacking the USS Liberty. So one reason I think that not more people are coming forward is because this is a tightly guarded Israeli secret. If in fact the explosives, if they were cloaked missiles, the missiles and the hijackings were all carried out by Israeli operatives, there aren't any people to talk about those particular things, except maybe a few very high-level personnel like Dick Cheney, and they're not gonna spill any beans.
And what about the potential pilots of the U.S. aircraft that would have shot down the flight over Shanksville?
I'm certain that Dick Cheney would have said, in the interest of national security, you're sworn to secrecy on this. We did it to save America, but I'll take responsibility. And Cheney knew that if anybody ever asked him, Dick Cheney, why he shot down Flight 93, if that became exposed, he would always say, I did it for America. I did it to save the White House. I believe he did it to save 9/11 from failing. That would be my answer. And
would there obviously there would be other government officials that would have been in the know, right? At a minimum, that things are not as they appear. For example, George W. Bush, the head of the CIA, the head of the National Security, the head of NORAD, the head of how do they square this?
That's a good question. Of course, as I was mentioning before, that how the Council on Foreign Relations dominates our cabinets. Quite often, it's not the ground level personnel, say at the CIA or the FBI, that you can't trust, but quite often it's the people. It's the James Comey types at the top that are very compromised individuals, and I think the answer probably lies there. And
if you say anything, if you say anything, this is what we have on you. This is what will come out. At a minimum,
that's one way they control people. Definitely is through. We've learned that through the whole Pizzagate, is that they. And they've done this for years. They did it to Woodrow Wilson. They blackmailed Woodrow Wilson, and when we got into World War I, they had a thing where he'd written love letters when he was at Princeton to a married woman, and they had those letters, and they blackmailed him. So, blackmail would be one. And they probably try to get generals in place that can also be that are part of this group. I mean, there are people in the military who will take part. After Pearl Harbor, they tried to scapegoat the commanders at Pearl Harbor, Admiral Husband Kimball and General Walter C. Short. Those guys fought back, and I think they learned a lesson from that. And they said, from now on, we're going to incorporate the military into our plans because we can't afford to have the military top brass exposing what we're doing. So I don't know specifically who would have been compromised at the highest levels. But yes, I would definitely say that there were people. Another thing to remember about NORAD, though, is that they were using this software from there was P-Tech and there's one other firm that they may have had their own. There was also all these military exercises taking place that day, multiple military exercises. So they chose a day of maximum confusion. And I even got an email just a couple of days ago from a guy from the Air National Guard who said that quite a few of the Air National Guard pilots were not in the area that day. They'd been sent to some conference. I mean, it's almost like everybody got sidetracked. As many pilots as possible were involved with these military games, multiple military exercises, and NORAD was watching these games, and they couldn't. It's like with the Boston Marathon. They have a drill that goes live. This was a drill that went live, and at first they're looking at this and they think, "Oh, this is just part of the exercise."
And by the time they would react, it would be too late.
So that worked. Played in the plans of these people who wanted to make sure they struck their targets before the military was able to get any fighters in their way and actually observe what was taking place.
James, do you have any hope that the truth will ever come out?
Well, I know that on what the Bible calls the Day of Judgment, every book will be opened and everything will be known and exposed at that time, and there's no bribing God. You can bribe a circuit court judge, but not God.
Or a Supreme Court judge.
But what we're still working on 9/11 after all these years. It's been one of the tougher nuts to crack as far as, we know pretty much how Pearl Harbor happened, although I'm sure there's certain secrets that got buried that we'll never know. But the truth does come out, and it's thanks to alternative media. It's thanks to shows like Caravan to Midnight that people do learn the truth. And, the enemy has money on their side, but they still have to tell lies. And I think personally that truth is a lot more powerful than all the lies that the CNN and the rest of the mainstream media can muster.
James, I think I'd like to thank you. You've been very generous with your time. I'd like to thank you for your efforts. For those people that have blinders on, you allow people, you give them the opportunity to think, okay, to put pen to paper, to put everything down, and you lay it out on your website, jamesperloff.com. Your blog post is outstanding because you document the facts that you have, and you say, here is what I believe is the case. This is not in granite, this is not in stone, but putting the facts together that I've ascertained under my studies, extensive studies. Here is what I believe is a possible scenario of what happened. And I think people are cheating themselves if they don't, at a minimum, look at what you've done. And they can find fault with it, and they can say, well, I think maybe this or that or whatever. But I think to just put blinders on and just say, okay, what the government told us happened on September 11th, 2001 is the absolute gospel, and it absolutely, and we can't even think about other options because a lot of people, James, have a real hard time with this. Okay, I mean, a huge to get their heads, just to get their heads around the fact that there are globalists behind the curtain that are really controlling things. A lot of people have trouble with that alone. And then when you start throwing this sinister, these horrible events at them about how these same people could have been involved in some of these events, people are like, well, Dave, whoever, you're off. I mean, that's not, that's even beyond paranoid. I mean, you're thinking like a criminal.
Well, they think like criminals. Let me just mention something that's an interesting comparison. After Pearl Harbor, there were people who tried to tell the people the truth. Not only Admiral Kimmel and General Short, but there was Rear Admiral Robert Theobald, who was in Pearl Harbor, commanding destroyers that day. He wrote a book called The Final Secret of Pearl Harbor, about it's called subtitled The Washington Contribution. Captain Lawrence Safford, who was the top cryptanalyst in the Navy Department, knew that Washington knew, and that the information was being destroyed in the files. And he spent much of his life trying to persuade people. But you know what they ran into? The roadblock they ran into is people said, our own government would never do that to us.
Right.
The exact same objection as 9/11. And that's why you need the big picture. You say, you know what? Our government has done that to us. They did it with the Maine, the Lusitania, Pearl Harbor, Tonkin Gulf, incubator babies, weapons of mass destruction, sarin gas, again and again. Yes, our government can and has repeatedly done that to us. And that's one reason why I wrote my book, Truth is a Lonely Warrior, to give people the context, because you need to know how the government is controlled by an oligarchy that runs America. And Ferdinand Lundberg talked about, in his 1937 book, America's 60 Families, he said, America's run by an oligarchy behind the trappings of democracy. That was 80 years ago. And you also have to help people to understand how there's 6 corporations that rule the mainstream media and give people this consolidated view of reality. And it's only in the alt media you can get outside of that. So you have to understand the history of false flags, who really runs the government, who controls the government, and then you're on the way. But if you only look at 9/11 without knowing the rest of the context, sure, it'll seem unbelievable. So that's why I feel that people need the big picture. And that's what you do with all these broadcasts, is you bring in one piece of the puzzle. And with my book, I try to tie it. I talk about vaccines, I talk about weather control, I talk about Zionism, I talk about media control. The Federal Reserve is part of it, obviously. So all of these things need to be discussed until people see. I compare it to a jigsaw puzzle. If you have one piece of a jigsaw puzzle, it doesn't make any sense. It's just a piece of color, right? But if you snap that piece of that jigsaw puzzle into the complete puzzle, then you see the big picture that the jigsaw is portraying. Now that piece makes sense. And I think with 9/11, it's the same thing.
Well, and James, you can relate to this, you being in the medical profession, but as a physician, the hardest thing I had to do throughout my career is tell someone that they have cancer. Now, when you deliver that bad news, there are basically two reactions over 32 years of experience of doing this that I get. One is somebody looks at it and you go, you know what, you're wrong, you're a hack, you don't know what you're doing, I'm out of here, I don't have cancer. Now, that person, James, is probably going to be dead in a box within a year. Then there are folks that will look at you and tell you that, it's not something they deserve, it's not something they want, it's not something they counted on, it's not something that they bargained for. And then they look at you and they go, okay, how do we go after this? How can we potentially make things better? And as a physician, it's a healthcare provider, it's hard. You look at the x-rays, you get the data back, and, I could walk in that room and tell that person, knowing full well that the tests say that they have something bad like cancer, and look at them and go, you're fine, goodbye. And they're going to walk out skipping and they're dead in a box within a year. Mm-hmm. So the hard decision is to say, no, you have cancer. And now we got to dissect it and we got to think about it and we have to develop a plan. And I think that's where we are with this, James. I think that we have enough evidence on the table that September 11th was cancer. And we can keep trying to deny that it's cancer and that it was these 19 dudes and they never flew a plane that was anywhere near the size of the plane that they were flying that day, and they miraculously hit the towers and they hit the Pentagon and all this other stuff. But essentially, I think of it, and I've come and understand, this has been an evolution for me, because my first part of that evolution started with that conversation with my dad. Mm-hmm. But we can deny all of this stuff, but I don't think we're doing anybody any favors unless we sit down and go, okay, I don't like what I'm hearing. I don't like this. It doesn't fit into my world of Andy Griffith and Mayberry RFD and the Dick Van Dyke Show. It doesn't fit into that, okay? And I don't like this. And I don't want to be here. And I don't want to have to look at it. And I don't want to have to dissect it. But somewhere along the line, you got to grow up. And you have to realize, I'm not living in Mayberry. I'm not in the Dick Van Dyke Show. And I don't like what I'm looking at. And I don't like the diagnosis I'm potentially looking at here, but I gotta put some effort into it and see exactly what's going on. Because, James, my concern is if we keep ignoring people like yourself, the very people that could well have been behind this will make their task much easier of their goal of a world government and stripping freedom and liberty from everybody. And I thank you for having the courage and the time and the effort to put this information in front of people. Not that they have to accept it, but they need to look at it and decide on their own, wow, maybe there really was something here and I need to look into this further. Your book, I believe is it's must read. Truth is a lonely warrior, and it really is a lonely warrior, because when you tell the truth, many people don't want to hear you, they don't want to be near you, they don't want to talk to you, and above all, they don't want to listen to you.
And I know many people in our audience can identify with that, and I just wanted to acknowledge what a great analogy you did about the cancer diagnosis. By the way, I've been diagnosed with cancer twice, successfully treated both times. The first time was stage 4, and By the way, I didn't. I accepted, but I did get a second opinion.
Good.
Before I moved. But I did then diligent research to find out how what the best methods of treatment were, including naturopathic versus allopathic methods, and that's exactly how we should be dealing with this diagnosis of this Luciferian group that's got a grip on our world. Is looking at studying it, understanding it as best we can, and then developing a plan to deal with it.
And again, James, how can folks follow you? Because they need to follow you. Okay.
Well, I'm on Twitter as James Perloff, and my website is jamesperloff.com, and you'll find information about my books there, and can scan through the various articles. Most of them listed right on the welcome page.
James, I thank you for everything.
Thank you, Dr. Janda. It's been a pleasure. Thanks so much for joining the team at Caravan to Midnight.
Well, it's an honor. I was honored that John B. Wells had enough faith in me to bring me to the family. And I thank you. I thank you for everything that you've done, everything that you're doing, and everything that you will do to restore freedom and liberty to every person, and not just in our country, but around the world.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there's some other people we've done some bad things to, and we need to apologize to and try to make their lives better.
Folks, you've been listening to Caravan to Midnight. This is Dave Janda signing off. Dream big,